So hi everyone, welcome back to the Bill for our public business meeting. I call this House to order and call on the Registrar Liz McBride to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
An ordinary public business meeting of the University Philosophical Society took place on the 5th of October with President Con McCarthy and the Chair. And I actually really just didn't write any minutes, so I just like to take this opportunity to just ask how everyone's getting on. How are you, Connor?
Good.
David?
Very good.
Irene?
Feeling pretty good, yeah?
Mark? Con?
Yeah, really good.
Harry, Morris? Yeah? Kira? Maeve, you okay? Good. Keen, you getting on?
Yeah,
okay.
pretty good.
Xavier?
Yeah, I'm pretty good.
Jack, Sinnott?
Yeah, I'm good.
Ross, Malurgy, how are you
Could
getting
be
on?
better.
Oh no, what's wrong? Umang, how are you? I'm good. Vincent?
Great.
Vinny?
Vincent, we were great. Very well, very well.
Cool. Ooh, American. Kate, how are you getting on?
Great, thank you for asking.
Unreal. Well, that's everyone. So they're being left.
Are there any objections to me signing these minutes? During a quick reflection? So hi everyone, you're all very welcome to the bill. The motion this week is this House would meet bigotry with violence, and we're delighted to be working with Sophia, the Society for International Affairs, on this motion. So I now invite their chair, Alice, to say a few words. Hear, hear.
So we're the Society for International Affairs on campus. Basically what we do is we invite politicians, diplomats, policymakers, economists to our society to speak every single week. So, for example, Monday next week we have the Japanese ambassador coming in. We also have on Tuesday Vincent Jark, who's an academic, and he's going to be talking about the political and humanitarian situation in Yemen. And coming up in the next few weeks we have the French ambassador coming in. We also have the Indian ambassador and the Sudanese ambassador. As well as that, we have Ambassadors Bowl, which is basically 40 diplomats as well as senators, and in the dining hall you get to choose whichever representative you want to sit beside, pick whichever country you would like, and chat with them and go out afterwards. As well as some other upcoming events, we're going to Madrid during reading week if anyone wants to join us. We also have an IOR Games night in a few weeks, as well as Game of Thrones themed MUN events. We do also run MUN on campus, so if you're interested in debating, which I presume most of you are, it's something similar to it, except it's the UN instead of Trinity College Dublin. And we run our own conference in March. So if you want to join, we will be outside.
Thanks to Alice and to Sophia for working with us on tonight's debate. Just to run through tonight's standing orders for the debate. So speeches are 7 minutes in length for student speakers, and after the first minute and before the last minute of each speech you'll hear a bell, which signifies that points of information can be offered from both the floor and from student speakers. We'd encourage general audience participation, so if you hear something you like, feel free to shout hear, hear, or if you hear something you dislike, you can shout shame. We'd also encourage you to look at the archery return sheets that can be found on your seats. These go towards rating the gold medal of archery at the end of the year, so please fill them out after each speech and then hand them to Kate and Umang, who'll be at the door after the debate. So to introduce the speakers for tonight's debate, on proposition we have Ross Malurgy, Jack Sinnott, Xavier Bradley and Cian Henry. Then on opposition we have Umang Kalra, Louis Hoffman, Kate Linley and Vincent Trometer. So without any further ado, we'll start the debate and we invite Ross Malurgy to open the case. Hear, hear.
Please don't judge me for my dress code. I wasn't exactly informed that. I was socially expected to wear a suit. Sorry about that. Judge me for my record. Okay, members of the University Philosophical Society, I'd like to begin this debate with a quote from Benito Mussolini. The socialists ask us, what is our programme? Our programme is to smash the heads of the socialists. My name is Ross Malurgy, and tonight I'd like to make the case for the proposition that this House should oppose bigotry with violence. I'd like to make three main points as to why I believe that this is the correct view to have, namely that fascists are co-opting centre-right movements and we must oppose that. We do not have viable alternatives to combating fascism peacefully at the moment. We must be unified in our opposition to bigotry and not squabble amongst ourselves. Addressing my first point, the opposition may believe we are being disingenuous when we label those who are clashing with anti-fascists on the streets in the United States as fascists, but the truth is we do not oppose the assembly of non-fascists. On the 6th of May 2017 in St. Paul, Minnesota, a group of Trump supporters assembled in Minnesota Capitol building in order to have their voices heard, and there was no violent incident. A group of anti-fascist protesters formed around the building to stop the mingling between ordinary Trump supporters and violent fascist thugs who could be seen hurling racist abuse and shaking hands with police officers. The Trump supporters would have had nothing to do with these people, and thanks to anti-fascist protesters, they didn't have to. When we draw our eyes to America at the moment, we see a deeply polarised society, where political movements previously seen as unfeasible, in the narrow Overton window of the American psyche are now gaining sway and drawing more media attention to those in the mainstream parties. In the digital age, discourse has been liberated, but this comes with pretty nasty side effects, namely that previously blacklisted ideologies are returning to the fore. We cannot deny that fascist movements have always existed in America as long as there has been fascism, from George Rockwell to David Duke, but never before has these groups been able to draw out such large numbers, especially in deeply liberal states such as California. However, we cannot pretend that these people are coming for civilised, rational debates. When Identity Europa organises busloads of armed neo-Nazis from the faraway Montana to fight in Berkeley, we cannot say that these are natural, sporadic gatherings on the streets. These people are here to make their presence known, often with shields, batons, and body armour. The opposition would have you believe that anti-fascists willy-nilly oppose any right-of-centre assembly or pro-Trump rally. But when you see the fascists such as Nathan D'Amigo or Jason Kessler, who organise such events as seen in Berkeley or the United the Right in Charlottesville, Virginia, you may begin to understand why these rallies have had the violence they have had. The opposition may even argue that the only reason these people are armed in the first place is in self-defence. This, again, is liberal optimism. Liberals proclaim freedom of speech and freedom of peaceful assembly. They look to idols of non-violent resistance such as Gandhi or Martin Luther King as their inspirations and point to them as reasons why dialogue and peace can bring about radical social change. They decry anti-fascists for their violent attacks and say that we are turning the masses towards fascism. I have no doubt that this can happen, but to say that the masses, let's not beat around the bush here and say that the masses are blindsided. These people are assembling at rallies are not Gandhi and they are not Martin Luther King. They want a white ethno-state and a separation of the races. The almost incessant need of liberals to defend the rights of people who, if given a chance, would have thrown them into a concentration camp is just absurd and seems to me that short-sighted philosophical dogma and general sound scruples. Many people in the room laugh at the very notion that fascism could ever have a comeback in the streets of a Western nation in the 21st century. Yet all around the world, we are seeing the rise of violent right-wing movements. We have seen decades of liberal discourse, the gentle sways between the centre-left and the centre-right. Yet this liberal consensus has done nothing to stop the growth of these movements. The liberal, argumentative, appeal-to-reason approach can no longer suffice in the face of a growing fascist threat. We cannot pray that logic will prevail, and these people will stop believing that Jewish cabals run the world. Indeed, we must strike quick and stop our petty squabbles among all people, left and right, to oppose fascists on the streets. The opposition may point towards the street war in the Weimar Republic, between communists and Nazis, as wider population of Germany turned towards Nazism. Besides excusing Nazi violence and only condemning left-wing violence, this argument does not stack up to the facts. Members of the SPD were barred from attending anti-fascist protests organised by communists in 1932. This left-wing infight... Here.
I would like to interrupt in just saying that please do not interpret American fascism and mistake it for European fascism. Two different things. Very two different things deriving from very two different ideologies and histories.
Why are two very different things? But quite frankly, in comparison, people who run over protesters in Charlottesville, people who stab Muslims on trains, I can't see the difference. The only difference is that they do not have the political power to move. Members of the SPD were barred from attending anti-fascist protests organised by communists in 1932. The left-wing infighting ultimately caused the Nazis to gain control of the streets, and through this vantage point, sway the hearts and minds of the average German. Despite this, in the 1933 elections, the SPD and the Communist Party of Germany did get more seats than the Nazis, and yet through their half-measure approach to combating Nazis, refused to unite against them and formed a coalition government. We must not make the same mistake again. Our moral high ground does not stem from some vague philosophical view of free speech, nor some unscientific belief in social Darwinism. Rather, our stance comes from our friends, family, fellow students, lovers, teachers and idols who are threatened with injury or worse by fascist thugs, simply for attributes that they were born into. And can't sit around and think of hypotheticals such as, well, we wish we could talk some more sense into these Nazis. I'd like to close my speech now with a quote from a man called Franz Friesen. Mr. Friesen wrote to the Irish Times in 1988 to congratulate the students at Trinity College on their choice to blacklist the notorious Holocaust denier David Irving. Mr. Friesen, a Holocaust survivor himself, stated, "If fascism could be defeated in debate, I assure you it never would have happened, neither in Germany, neither in Italy, nor anywhere else. I believe his words are more apt today than they were even then. And therefore I beg this House to propose the motion." Thank you for listening.
We thank Ross for his fine speech, and next up we have Iman Collar for the opposition. Hear, hear. As this is your first speech in the chamber, you are afforded what are called maidens' rights. You can choose, which means that no one in the audience can offer you points of information. You can choose to keep these rights or waive them and receive a rapturous round of applause. Which do you choose?
On the 15th of August, 1947, India achieved independence from the British Empire and became a nation. All over the world across the 20th century, peoples and lands and cultures began doing the same. Societies came together and placed their faith in ideas that were so powerful that they shaped entire identities. For the first time, we began building a world based on something extraordinary: principles, ideas, and values. We are at an unprecedented place in humanity's journey towards a better world. Our societies and networks and cultures flourish in the way that they do only because we have collectively placed our faith in the ideals of goodness, freedom, equality, peace. In doing so, we have created something bigger than ourselves. On the 16th of May 2014, after the world's largest ever election, a man named Narendra Modi was elected Prime Minister of India. Since then, a number of things have happened. A fervent, dangerous sentiment of Hindu nationalism has emerged in the country. The government has used this, along with its own machinery, to fundamentally endanger our democracy. Beef and cow slaughter have been banned, crippling the industries dependent on them, and eliminating one of the most crucial food sources for the urban poor: cheap meat. Muslims have been murdered by civilian mobs for allegedly eating beef, and often for nothing at all. On the 22nd of June 2017, days before the festival of Eid, a 15-year-old Muslim boy named Junaid Khan was stabbed in a train by a mob, thrown off the platform, where he bled to death. On the 5th of September 2017, a journalist named Gauri Lakesh, known for being spoken against the government, was stabbed in her home. Bigotry is threatening to destroy the most sacrosanct principles upon which our nation was built: the freedom to protest, the freedom of expression, of criticizing the government, the freedom of consciousness and religion, of equality, non-violence. It will succeed if we fail to uphold and protect these principles, and we cannot do so by contradicting them. Bigotry will succeed if we fight it with violence. History is filled with examples of violent revolution created better societies, but here's the thing: we are those better societies. We're at a place in time where law and justice and right and wrong have meanings greater than ever before, only because we as a society choose to believe in them, to cherish them, protect them. Our systems are by no means perfect, but they're the best that we have ever had, and there needs to come a time when we work to make them enough, rather than dismantle and abandon them in their entirety. This is that time. We must continue to create a better world, and we must do so through dialogue, conversation, education, the effective exercise of free speech. On the 26th of January 1952, India formally adopted its constitution. I worry every day that my country will not recover from what it is facing now. However, I know that no matter what happens, come hell or high water, in 2019 we will hold general elections again. We will vote again. This government is transient and our constitution is not. In 1952, it formalized the principles of goodness, freedom, tolerance, and it is on these principles that the organization of our society rests. And while we continue to subscribe to our constitution, we can be certain that these principles will persevere. We chose to place the law above individuals. We decided that the democracy of free expression is valuable and should be protected. We celebrated the success of peaceful and democratic protests. The only way for humanity to move forward is if we continue to place these principles above ourselves, if we continue to fight for them in the face of seeming hopelessness, because these principles are what define morality. They are what tell us that there is no legitimate room for hate speech, homophobia, racism, misogyny in our society. They tell us this because we choose to subscribe to our collective principles. We choose to organize ourselves in line with them. We choose to defend them and build our world around them. By resorting to violence, we delegitimize these principles. By failing to act within the law, we make the law meaningless and lose the ability to hold others accountable to it. We lose constitutional remedy. We lose the right to have the bigots of the world held accountable for their actions. We lose the ability to prosecute them for their crimes of hatred, the ability to see them in prison for not acting in accordance with the values of civilized society. If we resort to violence, we reject the framework upon which our world rests. It is only as strong as we make it, and we destroy it as soon as we place ourselves above it. Nationhood, morality, rights, all of these are incredibly powerful and valuable ideas, but they are only as powerful as our faith in them. And so we must continue to have faith. The entirety of human history has been a journey towards a better, safer, and happier world, and we are not there yet, but we are closer than we have ever been. I believe that the world we have created today is incredibly beautiful, for it exemplifies the powers of the human mind. We are surrounded by things that have no tangible basis, yet continue to govern our lives, our way of thinking, our societies. These systems are some of the most valuable creations of humankind and must be protected. All of history has led to them, and it is crucial that we move forward rather than starting back up over and over again. The world we have is in desperate need of change. We must implement this change using the institutions that have been passed down to us. We must apply to them our continuously evolving system of ethics. One of the greatest things about them is that they allow and invite change. We must exercise democratic will and allow our political systems to adapt to our needs. Our laws are greater than brute force, and we must use them to fight bigotry. They may be frustrating, difficult, and inadequate at times, but if we continue to believe in them, to evolve them to our needs, they will come through. If we resort to violence, we don't eliminate bigotry, we simply create more violence. Right and wrong doesn't exist without society agreeing that it does. If we resort to violence, we withdraw ourselves from that decision and cease to subscribe to our hard-won principles of morality. We cease to subscribe to our laws. We leave room for more bigots, because there will be nothing left to define what bigotry is. There will be nothing left to define right and wrong, because the only way that any singular idea of right and wrong can be enforced if it is enshrined and enacted in the law of the land. We may want to believe that our personal beliefs are absolute, but they are not. We need the law. Civilization requires the law to function effectively, to function at all. We must keep our faith in it, in our principles, and believe that our institutions will overcome, that they are stronger than any individual. We must believe in something bigger than ourselves. They continue to be the exercise of democratic will, which is what we must exercise. Our civilization is too tenuous, our world is too new, and far, far too precious. We must work within our laws, our institutions, our collective principles, or risk losing them to humanity. Oppose.
We thank Umang for her fine speech. And next up for the proposition, we have Jack Sinnott. Here. Jack, as this is also your first time speaking in the chamber, you're afforded maiden's rights. Do you choose to keep them, or would you like to waive them?
I'll waive. Chairperson, members of the House, my name is Jack Sinnott. I'm here today to propose this motion that this House would meet bigotry with violence. I'll be bringing you three main points: those of the effectiveness of violence in fighting decentralised groups, the urgency with which we must remove radical ideology from public discourse, and the reliability of combining violence and non-violence to achieve even greater results. And I'll also provide some refutation of the opposition's arguments. My first point concerns effectiveness. The opposition are at pains to point out tonight how effective non-violent methods have been and can be in fighting oppression and injustice. Without a doubt, this historical evidence cannot be refuted. There are, of course, numerous examples of successful non-violent protests, from the American Civil Rights Movement in the mid-20th century to the women's suffrage movement of the mid-1910s. But something that almost all successful non-violent movements have had in common is the nature of the injustice they've been combating. In general, non-violence has been immensely successful in fighting overtly institutionalized injustice and overthrowing overthrowing bigoted regimes and administrations. Non-violence allows expansive movements to bring whole countries to a standstill through strikes, works to rules, boycotts, protests, etc. And this can have a huge impact in overcoming national and supranational threats. But what the West is currently dealing with now is not corrupt dictatorship. These regimes still exist in the wider world at large, of course, and the validity of different tactics in combating such administrations is up for debate. But if we wish to combat all bigotry in our society, which we the proposition believe we should, we must develop tactics for fighting homegrown hate groups. In the West right now, institutionalized injustice is, broadly speaking, one of attitude and not one of legislation. And the movements which currently promote bigotry and hatred are decentralized and scattershot. The alt-right movement, for example, existing primarily online, is a perfect example of one such group that can't be directly targeted by collective peaceful action, or even by the institutional means proposed by Uma tonight. Such alt-right groups in the US or Pegida supporters in Germany, to name some examples, aren't going to be affected by mass strikes of civil disobedience in the way that such non-violent measures were paralysing, to say, Poland's Soviet puppet government during the Solidarity movement of the 1980s. In addition to this, the groups currently espousing hateful ideologies in the West are made up of extreme individuals, wholly committed to their cause. For example, despite the persistent media condemnation of right-wing groups in America, membership of far-right movements continues to grow, with the Southern Poverty Law Centre currently tracking more than 1,600 extreme right-wing groups in the country.
Point of information.
Yeah.
You know that all the systems, courts, things like that Umam just cited in her speech are able to prosecute people for using hate speech online, correct?
They are able to prosecute people for using hate speech online, but they're not able to totally eradicate bigotry in our society. If they were, the events in Charlottesville would never have happened. So, to continue with what I was saying, despite the persistent media condemnation of right-wing groups, they're still growing. These individuals aren't likely to be dissuaded by protests or even rational argument. The traditional non-violent technique of turning society at large against the aggressor has had seemingly no impact on these hate groups. If peaceful protest won't change their minds, and civil disobedience doesn't affect them, what, ladies and gentlemen and others, are we to do to stop these destructive organisations? The answer is not a pretty one, but it is a necessary one. Though none of us like to admit it, violent opposition would be a key tool in quelling the impact and force of these groups. And from a purely pragmatic standpoint, no thank you, could be vital in combating the new face of bigotry in our society. My second point regards the need to act, and the need to act quickly. In a world where neo-Nazis are massing in the streets, and even elected officials refuse to condemn their actions, we don't have time to plan a detailed, coordinated non-violent strategy. We don't have time to wait for these institutions to quell the actions of hate groups. In Charlottesville-like scenarios, actions must be taken immediately to oppose hate groups and their actions. A peaceful protest after the fact, or some similar non-violent action, lacks the potency, the urgency, the severity that such an important cause requires. While non-violence can be effective over long, sustained periods of time, we need to take more urgent action to prevent the rise of fascism and hatred in our society. The very nature of the issue means it can't be allowed to fester and develop. The longer bigotry is afforded any kind of legitimacy in our society, the more opportunities there are for people to get taken in by its toxic ideology, the more it grows in strength, and consequently the more difficult it becomes to combat. We, the proposition, must reluctantly recognise that immediate action is required, and the non-violence, unfortunately, does not offer such a necessarily swift resolution. Neo-fascists and bigots in our society have spent the last decade demanding our attention. Now that they have it, our only option is to respond with aggression. My final point relates to the way in which we use violence as a tool for suppressing bigotry. We, the proposition, see the use of violence very much as a last resort, and have already outlined the reasons why we feel the point of no return has already been passed, and violence is necessary in our current political climate. This does not mean we have to abandon non-violence entirely. In fact, some of the most successful political liberation movements in history have been based on the system of predominant non-violence. No thank you. A system that combines mass non-violent protest with brief, necessary acts of aggression. The eradication of apartheid in South Africa, for example, is regularly used as an example of effective non-violent social change. But according to figures, no thank you, uncovered by American political scientist Stuart Kaufman, over 15,000 people were killed in the movement's later, more militant phase of protest. No one can argue that this leader's death is a good thing, but it's fair to say that without it, the anti-apartheid movement might never have been so successful. Time and time again, throughout history, no thanks, we see that non-violence can only get us so far, and at some stage of the protest, violence becomes a necessary enemy. It's there in the shift from Kingian idealism to black power in the civil rights movement. in the final moments of Otpor's deposition of Milosevic in Serbia, in the overthrow of Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos. These examples not only provide evidence of the limited ability of nonviolence to achieve total and tangible change in extreme circumstances, but also show us how effective the combination of violence and nonviolence can be. As much as we wish this were not the case, violence can be a benefit in achieving social change. And if we are serious about abolishing bigotry in a tangible way, it is something we must embrace. I'll conclude with a quote from science fiction and fantasy author John Scalzi, who said, "It's not an effective protest if you're not pissing people off." Ladies, gentlemen, and others, the only way for us to remove bigoted views and ideology from our society is through violent protest. And for this reason, I beg you to propose.
Thank Jack for his fine speech, and just a reminder to everyone to fill out the oratory returns as you go. Next up on opposition we have Louis Hoffman. Here, here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, my esteemed members of the opposition, my noble opponents upon the proposition. My name is Louis Hoffman, and today I shall be strongly opposing the motion that this House would be bigotry with violence. I'd first off like to say that bigotry is actually defined as being opposed to someone else's views, so I'd like to say proposition, well done on that one. But the way in which the verb for this debate described the motion, and the way in which members of this House have brashly put forward their ideas, one could be mistaken for assuming that bigotry was a peculiarity that only plagued the political right. This is nothing other than a falsehood. The very dogma which we so, hey, you're going to struggle with this, the very dogma which we so chastise is a plague and pestilence that is endemic in our society, be it the foul scum that is Antifa or the vile alt-right. Both propagate hate and authoritarian values that have no place for you. You're not in the minute, mate, no. Both propagating hate and authoritarian values that have no place in a civilized society. But this motion is nothing other than propaganda. The proposition are fighting a battle that they want to fight, believing that their ideological opposition are a force of abject evil. They are attempting to dehumanise the opposition in such a way that barbarity can be justified to the masses. All we've heard so far are in fact lies. The foul pontifications of the proposition have presented nothing other than a positive obstacle to the objective truth I spent a long time. The proposition has lied to you. They have lied to you because of their intellectual arrogance. They believe you are too stupid, that you are incapable of logical thoughts and simply nothing other than a mindless sheep. For them, the ordinary man and woman is not fit to make their own decisions, for they believe that people are so fickle-minded that at the mere sounding of a slightly controversial opinion, you'll either kill yourself after being so offended, or take to the streets demanding the overthrow of democracy, yelling Heil Hitler with the best of them. This is why they advocate for the use of violence, to keep those who dissent and don't conform down. They advocate for it because they don't trust you to know the difference between the right opinion and the wrong opinion. They advocate for it because it is easier to use violence to silence our ideological opponents than to use dialogue to convince them of the validity of our arguments. This motion is in fact, this motion in reality is actually more about the concept of being offended. To be offended is utterly subjective. You as an individual decide what offends and what does not. So in essence, when this House wants to take a stance on fighting perceived bigotry, it is in reality attempting to take a stance on whether we have the right to freedom of expression, the right to offend, the right to dissent, free from intimidation and violence. I firmly believe that one has the ability and right to think and say whatever they want, but of course be subject to liability. I don't believe you should be able to label someone a homophobe or a Nazi without the ability to prove it, in the same way I don't believe you should be able to simply label someone a child molester. This House is attempting to become the arbitrator and legislator of an entirely subjective thing, and this tidal wave of insanity eludes even I. How can we decide and legislate on the subjective? For often when people disagree with us, we project upon them our most foul ideas. We spend so long dealing with the worst of the worst intellectually that we assume that anyone who doesn't agree with us is obviously the polar opposite of us. We often don't know what people actually think, and so we imprint upon them what we like them to think, what we think they should think, what we think they think, so as to advance our own political cause. I know this all too well, after helping set up the Burkean Journal. Of course I was going to focus. Be it in D2, in which I I was called a disgusting, awful pro-life prick, despite having never once advocated a single pro-life view on any platform. Or maybe it was in St. Bean Street, in which a girl whose jaw looked like it was on Erasmus called me a horrible, disgusting homophobe. What I'm attempting to highlight here is the dangerous trend in which we as a society are so quick to classify someone who's made out to disagree with us as some form of other. Who, because they think differently on one thing, they must think differently on everything, who if they aren't with us are against us. We then classify this distinct group within society that don't think and act the same way as us, don't deserve the same respect we do. If the proposition were to have its way, we would be allowed to hunt them down and attack these people, hurt them because they are bigoted, when in reality it is being painfully them who have been bigoted today. By saying anyone who dissents and refuses to conform to the one true ideological thought is a bigot, what we have done is created a pseudo-orthodox and become a paradoxical Western Saudi Arabia in which the mainstream is not allowed to be questioned, not allowed to be challenged, or least of all broken. Does no one else see the danger in the fact that we have intelligent people advocating for the isolation, exclusion, and use of violence upon a minority? It is an odd day when I, a supposed conservative, has to warn the liberal majority of the dangers of such careless and violent rhetoric. The fact that violence has even been suggested sickens me. How can violence ever be the answer? Did Martin Luther King, Gandhi, or John Hume use violence to combat institutional oppression? No. Simply put, to use violence is to lose legitimacy in oneself. How can one respect a prophet who preaches peace and tolerance in one breath and in the next advocates the strangling of the non-believer? To use violence does nothing other than to damage your cause. You embolden the bigots. You make them into martyrs, their fallen comrades becoming nothing other than a rallying call to those who refuse to conform, who mitigate their internal differences, and become something far, far more dangerous than they ever were before. The only reason that the proposition so happily advocates for such extremism is because it's not they who face the hangman's noose, the firing squad, or the jail cell. Well, at least not yet. To truly combat bigots, you are better to let them speak. Cheers. You are better to let them speak. Let them prove themselves to be fools. Let them prove themselves to be idiots so that all rational people can laugh and actually engage in debate to show these cretins up for what they truly are. And yes, I've unfortunately come to the conclusion that that's no doubt why they feel let me speak today. Within Trinity for me would be the youth wing of the people before profit. But why would I bother to use violence against them? Why would I bother to censor them or stop them meeting up and discussing their cute little fantasies when I can run around and make such utter and complete fools of themselves that they make themselves far more electable than I could ever hope to do by simply blacklisting them or smashing their heads in with a cricket bat? To conclude, I pose to you, today it is I who is the bigot, tomorrow it could be you. Today it is I who is to defend the right to free speech, free from intimidation and violence, tomorrow it could be you fighting to restore it. A room of pseudo-intellectual fascists are using emotive and passionate language to get you to abandon what makes this country great, to get you to abandon the only thing that ensures we can come to college and speak our minds freely, that we can march on the streets and demand same-sex marriage, that we can march on the streets and demand the right to repeal the 8th Amendment. To quote Tywin Lannister, when you tear out a man's tongue, you are not telling the world he's a liar, only that you fear what he might say. Opposed.
Thank Louis for his fine speech. And next up for proposition, we have Xavier Bradley. You're here. Xavier, as this is also your first time speaking in the chamber, you're afforded maiden's rights. Okay.
Right, well, first off, I'd like to congratulate Phil for one-upping the hist on
right-wing intellectual speakers. They are Nigel Farage. Somehow you guys got Richard Spencer. Members of the University Philosophical Society, Mr. Chair. Under specific circumstances, it is beneficial for a society to react to antagonistic and inflammatory rhetoric with the use of force when such rhetoric calls for violence, ethnic cleansing, discriminatory practice, and especially if fascist and racist ideals are included. I'll put forward an argument this evening to highlight why the use of force against bigotry is, in fact, the right thing to do. I will address the following points to convince the House to pass this motion. Highlighting the recent rise of right-wing authoritarian violence and the intrinsically violent nature of bigoted ideology, the paradox of tolerance, and the promulgation of such philosophies by the state. To summarize the 20th century social theorist and German philosopher Karl Popper, tolerance is a self-contradictory concept. As principle, tolerance dictates that we must be equally accepting to all manner of speech, regardless of its vulgarity and danger. A topical example of this type of diverse dynamic society, can be found in the Weimar Republic of post-World War I that my colleague Ross mentioned earlier. Popper escaped the rise of fascism there and found asylum in the US, where he formulated his theory on the paradox of tolerance. As stated previously, tolerance is required to be universally applied, according to its own nature. If this is so, then tolerance requires us to tolerate even intolerance. Thus, if somebody is preaching or practicing intolerance, the tolerant person cannot, in principle, speak out against what the intolerant person is doing, since speaking out against intolerance would itself be an act of intolerance. This is clearly self-contradictory, since tolerance cannot condone what it specifically sets out to be against, but it nevertheless requires itself logically to do just that. Thus, the necessity to break tolerance in order to preserve a tolerant society becomes apparent. It is not in the nature of fascist and racist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, American Nazi Party, and the alt-right movement to reason or maintain dialogue with their opponents. To cite an oft-quoted 1932 speech by the Nazi Führer Adolf Hitler himself, only one danger could have jeopardized this development, in reference to the rise of fascism in the 1930s. If our adversaries had understood its principle, established a clear understanding of these ideas, and not offered any resistance, or, alternatively, if they had from the first day annihilated with the utmost brutality the nucleus of our new movement. It would be neglectful to tackle this issue without first accounting for the social and political context that surrounded it. As my two colleagues have pointed out, we're at a seminal time in social upheaval. The accumulation of social stratification, unrest with the status quo, and a general rejection of the centrist politics as usual manner of governance has led to an overwhelming victory for the reactionary right throughout the Western world, more so than at any point since the 1930s. Piggybacking on legitimate concerns about extreme wealth inequality and a fundamental misconception of the events of globalism, Trump, Le Pen, and Farage, to name but a few, have opened the floodgates for intolerant extremists. In the US, this tribalism has been exacerbated by glee by white supremacist groups that have long been dormant, but have now stepped out from the shadows, ready to recruit. By allowing bigoted extremists to espouse their rhetoric unchecked, they're given a free pass to organize, grow their ranks, and spread their message, a message which spans from racial segregation to outright mass genocide. Individuals with links to white supremacism have carried out attacks and multiple murders throughout the recent past in the US. You can look at, as my colleague pointed out in his rebuttal, the two men who had their throats slit in Oregon over the past summer by a violent neo-Nazi. The two men were protecting 13 and 14-year-old Muslim girls. Or we can point to Heather Heyer, who was brutally struck down when a white supremacist decided to plow his car into a group of peaceful protesters. You can look at Dylan Roof, who massacred 9 parishioners, 9 black parishioners, solely because he believed in the separation of races, and because he had been radicalized by these right-wing groups online. Had these groups been targeted and efficiently destroyed from the beginning, would we have had these massacres? Would we have these outbursts of violence?
I find it hard to propose that they would still exist. Yes, I'll take it.
Do you propose that you kill the people with the opposing views, and if not, beat them up and prevent them from speaking if they continue to speak what you do?
Fair point. No, I'm not proposing that they're killed. I'm just proposing that if they march, if they organize, there be a backlash. Make them question their views. Make them wonder why someone would have such a virulent reaction to their ideology. If you go out in the streets with your Confederate flag, with your baseball bats, what are you looking for? You're looking for a fight. You're looking to have your rhetoric confirmed. If you realize that people aren't going to lie down and accept that, I don't know, maybe it's a bit optimistic in me. If you don't realize it, then perhaps, I don't know, force is where I would go. Moving on to my final point, concerning state-sponsored ideology. The freedom of speech and the merits of a tolerant society are best exhibited when they fulfill their purpose of protecting minority sentiments from the persecutions at the hand of the state and other entities. Now, some of the opposition might object that bigots and the groups that represent them are very much, in fact, a minority. I'll argue that although only a small percentage of society makes up the menaces that I've illustrated beforehand, many features of the state apparatus are proactive in supporting their perspective. Just to name a few statistics in the US, both the prison and police systems are structurally tools of racial oppression and further reemphasize the worldview of the bigoted zealot. In state prisons across the US, African Americans are incarcerated 5.1 times the rate of whites. Maryland has a prison population of 71% black inmates, although 30% of the state population are African American. I'm running out of time, so I'd just like to close with a quote here. Despite the mighty institutions behind them, it is my opinion it is our duty as citizens to silence those who would inflict harm upon us and our brothers and sisters, regardless of class, race, and ethnicity. In the words of Leon Trotsky, if you cannot convince a fascist, acquaint his head with the pavement. Thank you, and please pass this
We thank Xavier for his fine speech. And next up for opposition, we have Kate Kleinley.
Some violent, bitter man, some powerful man, called architect and artist in, that they, bitter and violent men, might rear in stone the sweetness that all longed for night and day, the gentleness none there had ever known, but when the masters buried mice can play. And maybe the great-grandson of that house, for all its bronze and marble, is but a mouse. William Butler Yeats, Meditations in Times of Civil War, a poem about one man perpetuating violence, then attempting to rebuild a peaceful utopia in a world so scarred by the violence that he inflicted that that world can no longer know beauty, that no future generation can know peace. Violent hearts, argues Yeats, cannot create a peaceful utopia. The creation of a better future does not justify using violent means together. This poem is an allegory for those who, today, seek to build a better future by violently dividing our society along racial, political, socio-economic lines. It is also an allegory for the proposition. They tell us to create a better world by any means necessary, seeking a just and tolerant society, ironically by violently annihilating anyone who doesn't fit their definition of tolerance. No one can think and hit someone at the same time. No one can employ violence against whomever they choose, while still claiming to embrace principles like liberalism and equality. Umar was dead right. Here's the issue. I'm fine with punching a Nazi, if a Nazi punches me or anyone else. I'm fine with striking ISIS, because ISIS strikes civilians every damn day. I will always be willing to meet violent bigotry with violent, swift, and resounding self-defense, but I will never incite bloodshed, particularly not because of something as nebulous as perceived bigotry. If I have to, I will meet violence with violence, but that isn't what we're here to debate. Sure.
Isn't it true that the police and the carceral state inflict violence on minority communities every single day, routinely?
Sure, but then
why isn't it okay for them to strike back against them?
If you are going to strike back against them, you're striking back against unjust violence. You're not striking back against ideological bigotry. I'm saying, if they act upon that bigotry, strike back. If not, the motion is that this House would meet bigotry with violence. Bigotry, not violence. I'd like to remind you all of how subjective the word bigotry is. There are many people, including loads of people on this campus, ready to call you a bigot for miswording a sentence, not knowing something about a group that you might not have been acquainted with before, just generally for holding different ideologies than they do. Bigot has become a catch-all for someone who functions and thinks differently than you do. In our divided political climate, the word bigot is constantly hurled as a loaded insult. Anything can now be called bigotry if it upsets us or challenges our worldview. Under Prop's framework, we aren't just talking about punching Nazis or roughing up the KKK. Depending on who's talking, we could very well be talking about openly attacking scores of people who disagree with us, whether they're legitimately bigoted or not. Ross came up here and spoke extensively about opposing violent factions, conveniently conflating subjective bigotry with literal Nazism. They're not the same thing. That's just not what we're talking about. But even if we are talking about real bigotry, genuine racism, sexism, homophobia, I still don't see the point in violence. Sure, punching Richard Spencer makes for a catchy photo op, and it makes Antifa look really badass. But it does literally nothing to reduce his platform. In fact, violently opposing him only radicalizes him and his followers. Violence does not make them question their beliefs. The same photo of Richard Spencer being punched that liberals hold up as a token of victory is one that he holds up to his followers, saying, look how much those in the cultural mainstream hate us and people like us. Follow me more closely and we'll take them down. It's the classic case of isolation and radicalization. Discourse with these people would demonstrate that they aren't rejected from the mainstream, that every member of broader society could accept them if they accepted every member of broader society. Violence erases the possibility of that. Committing an act of violence also frames the offending party in an extremely unflattering way. Yes, violence gets attention, but at the end of the day, cultural movements aren't about attention. Cultural movements are about numbers, because culture is controlled by the masses. The distinction between this debate and one about political violence is that, yes, political violence can get things done. You can pressure your government into changing policy by upsetting the balance of power through violence until it's no longer in their favor. However, we're talking about stopping bigotry, about ideological violence, and that's a phenomenon in people's minds. To stop bigotry, you need to change those minds, not just turn the balance of power against them. You need a cultural trend. You need all of society to agree with you. You must convince the masses that bigotry is wrong, that tolerance is good, and that you are representing liberalism and a better way of life. Violence just scares them. Violence means that people oppose you, and violence won't get those goals. Jack tells us that anti-hate speech laws are flawed and that we need to turn to violence because they don't work 100% of the time. First of all, that's an unreasonable burden to place upon our side of the house. Second of all, it's one that his arguments don't reach either. A really great example of violence failing as a cultural trend is Antifa, operating in the United States. They're constantly attacking, violently, bigots, but haven't actually accomplished anything concrete, except turning literally everyone, including most left-wing people, against the radical left. What they perceive as bigotry has now gotten, thanks to them, more news coverage and more, airtime than they ever would have before. By embracing chaos and instigating violence at random, they've turned the cultural tide against themselves, to change the minds of the public, to get them on their side. You can't constantly be instigating violence, and you can't force the public to constantly live in fear. As a cultural catalyst, violence does not and cannot work. It's been proven time and time again, and Jack literally admits that this is irrefutable. Prop chooses to ignore this, instead advocating for an ineffective method that provides them instant gratification and a smug sense of moral superiority. Ultimately, Prop are advocating for society which they claim will be a masterpiece of liberalism. But you cannot paint a masterpiece in your opponent's blood. Meeting bigotry with violence gives us a society where violent demonstration becomes the norm, where perceived aggression can and will lead to violent retaliation and bloodletting on both sides. It gives us Ferguson, it gives us Charlottesville, and it gives us UC Berkeley, a university where Antifa has taken over, where violence occurs to such extremes that it makes international news, where my friends can't get to class because lecture halls are blocked by police blockades, and where their parents wondering about the safety of their child at what used to be the most prestigious public university in America. Constant conflict, constant violence, constant fear, all in the name of tolerance. That's not a society I'm willing to live in, and it's not one I'm willing to inflict upon any undemocratic future. Terrifyingly. No matter which way you feel about this motion, it is a future that we're moving towards. Vote up.
We thank Kate for her fine speech, and just a reminder to the floor that points of information can only be offered between the first and last minute of each speech. Next up on proposition we have Keen Henry. Here, here.
Thanks, everyone. It's nice to be back. So I think there are two debates happening tonight. I think there are two tangential debates. One is about a collective violent uprising, and the other one is about individualized acts of violence which occur against individual acts of bigotry. So those two debates to me are separate. Just the way that I interpret the motion is I'm basically going to focus on the second one, though I know a lot of people talk about the first. So my contention isn't that individual acts of violence are going to change the world. I think that's an unfair burden. It's not my claim that this is going to be at the forefront of a new social movement. My contention is that there's no principal basis for condemning violence when it is exacted against someone who uses bigotry against you. My argument is a moral one. It's one that says we can't condemn people who are put in that position. I listen to the opposition speeches, and they bear little resemblance to the views I or anyone else holds. I don't advocate indiscriminate violence against anyone who holds a different view to me. I don't believe the bigots are just people who hold different views to me. I know it's popular to caricature leftists who believe in things like that. The vast majority of us don't. I understand that, let's say, a large proportion of people who hold or even express bigoted views are people who genuinely don't understand what they're saying, who are willing to learn, and people with whom discourse is a valuable thing that will produce a social good. I absolutely believe that. However, we also have to recognise that there is a subgroup of people who simply do not want to learn, who want to tear apart society, and don't care and will not listen to reason. And it's those people that I'm talking about. When these kind of people approach people, often members of minority communities, and verbally abuse them, then in those cases I think we have to look to something different, because the laws simply aren't adequate to address things like that. And that's, I guess, what I'll address in my case. So I'm basically, for my speech, I'm going to talk about violence and how I think it's an amorphous concept, which I think lies at the heart of the problems in this debate. Okay, so in my POI with Kate, it kind of became clear that it's difficult to define exactly what bigotry is. It's difficult to define where you draw the line. And I guess Kate and probably most of the other side draw the line with physical violence. I want to make the point that just focusing on individual acts of physical violence is very reductive. And I think it kind of ignores a large proportion of how violence actually is represented in society. So I want to talk about state violence. So for example, the way that the state forcibly holds people in direct provision, provides them with far less than they can possibly live on for people without jobs, for example, the way it structurally deprives them of enough to live on, that's violent. There's no way that you can deny that those acts are violent simply because they aren't committed by a single person and because they involve no element of physicality. I don't see what the point of obsessing over physicality is. The same with everything the state does in terms of the carceral state, in terms of the fact that in America it holds literally millions of people within prisons on people who have never seen an actual trial, the kind of torture it inflicts on them routinely. Like I mentioned in my point of information, the kind of everyday physical brutality that the police use in minority communities that's subject to absolutely no challenge whatsoever within polite liberal society. These cases never go to court. No one has the power to bring those cases to court, and they never have any, there's no overview to these things. want to make the point that the distinction between physical and psychological violence is basically wrong. We wouldn't accept this distinction in so many other walks of life. We wouldn't accept there's a difference between physical suffering and psychological suffering. So it's unclear to me why we roundly condemn physical violence in every case. But for some reason, psychological violence is viewed as different, and the way that we deal with this is in a different way. Like, fundamentally, a lot of these cases where people are like verbally assaulting people and using, I don't know, like racial epithets or slurs against people. These things often go to the heart of someone's identity. These things are violent because they aggress against someone's very basic identity. And it's unclear to me why, if you're a minority, say you're an immigrant in a country and someone comes up to you and tells you that you don't belong there, that this isn't your country, and so on and so forth. It's unclear to me why that isn't violent and why that's not considered a violent act, merely because you know. So frequently, like, those are the kind of things that can truly harm people, really in a lasting way, in a way that like hitting a Nazi or whatever never will. They'll always come back from it. It's not a big deal compared to the physical, the psychological anguish that they can force people to go through. So that distinction is unclear to me. Like, what is clear to me is that the kind of cases I'm talking about, these people often use violence as an absolute last resort. Like, a lot of what the guys are saying is basically that they should go through, I guess, like the typical liberal institutions, like the courts, like they should vote or whatever. I just think it's insulting in particular cases to tell people who are constantly oppressed by the state and constantly bullied by people in the streets that they should just go and vote or bring their case to court. That's not a reality for the vast majority of people. Like, the vast majority, especially vulnerable people in society, don't at all have the means to bring a case to court, for example. Like, there was some talk about hate speech laws. Hate speech laws are so weak, especially within America. They're unbelievably weak because they're undermined by the First Amendment, obviously. But not only that, but like, the idea that when someone is aggressed upon like that, they simply have the ability to just walk into court and have their injustice done right is completely ridiculous. Like, there are some cases in which it's totally legitimate for people to exact a small amount of violence against someone. That's totally proportionate. I don't see anything wrong with that. So I don't agree with this thing of like laws are always just and we should always abide by the idea that laws are just. It's obviously not true. There are obviously horrific laws out there that fundamentally go against people's identities. But also, I guess finally, to talk about, on a more practical level, there's the idea that we should not we should not bring them down to our level, or we should not go down to their level or whatever. Like, the problem is the kind of people, and again, I am talking about a limited set of people, the kind of people I'm talking about, these people are already violent. Like, Nazis need no invitation to be violent. It's not as if they're simply waiting on the sidelines for someone to like push someone or react physically, and then they'll begin to exact like wide-ranging physical violence against people. That's not the way it works, and it's not the way it ever will. So my argument is that in those limited cases, it's certainly fair for people to liberate their own identities by exacting personal justice in those small cases, and that's the kind of justice that the state would never ever do for them. Thank you.
We thank Keane for his fine speech, and to close the case for the opposition and lead the debate as whole is Vincent Trometer. Here, here. Vincent, would you like to keep your maiden's rights, or do you?
Okay. By all means.
Wow.
I had a speech written, and after the stuff that I heard today, if I can't speak from the heart as an American, then I can't call myself as an American, honestly. My friend here, where are you from in the United States? I'm from Indiana. I'm from Pennsylvania. So you have very valid points, and I will make a lot of concessions to this, but I'll say to my colleague right here is, it's not that desperate yet. And so I had a whole bunch of statistics here. I'm just going to name, just happy to leave on this. So within the past 2 years, the FBI has pretty much went out with a report that says hate crimes in the United States have increased by 25% within the last 2 years, which is the third, and so 2017 would be the third consecutive year where hate crimes has increased, which is the first time that that's happened since the 3 years that followed 9/11. So I'm looking around, and it's a very youthful crowd here. In the United States, 2002, 2001, 2002, 2003, if you were a Muslim, if you were a Sikh, man, that was a bad time to live in the United States, because you couldn't walk out of your front door without wondering if someone's going to come up to me and punch me in the face, or someone's going to call me a swear word.
Oh, yeah. So you mentioned the FBI statistics. I guess I would just mention that, going back to my point, the FBI just formed a special task force for the investigation of extreme black identity groups. But they have had no such designation of resources towards any of the white supremacist extremists.
That is very true.
Further in the case for state-sponsored violence.
Yes, well, and this is the point. All right, so I'm looking around, and it's not a very diverse crowd over here. To say the least. But let me shed some light on look at where I come from. All right, so where I come from, which is in Appalachia in Pennsylvania, which is a homogeneous white population, I grew up with the notion that there was a segment of the black community that lived in my town that lived pretty much by institution in this particular part of town. And growing up, as the first memory of as a child was pretty much 9/11. Growing up, you lived in an already politically tensified, rhetoric going on. And so things just started to escalate. And, some tensions that have always been there, like, for instance, like 2000, if you were bigoted against Muslims, that really showed after 9/11. But racism in the United States has always been there. And even after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln didn't pardon the people who were in the Confederacy. And some of those people became governors of states in the South. And, statues started to pop up in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s to honor these people who basically bred black people and used them for property. So it was already politically charged. And I remember I grew up in this small town, and God help the kid, there was this Nigerian that came to our school, and I was in kindergarten, all right? And he was tormented to the point where he had to leave school because he was black. And he had to leave because people were bullying him and stuff, but there was always a bullying in school, but you get punished for bullying. You didn't get punished for bullying this time, all right? So I remember, I was a kid, and I wasn't originally from that area. I was from Philadelphia, which is a little more liberal, and so I tried to be this kid's friend, and because he was completely, constantly being tormented and stuff. So I tried to be his friend, and then I was starting to be ostracized by the people who were white in my class, because I was being friends with the guy who was the younger. And so I was 6, so, what else? You don't really know the dynamics of it. So what did I do? I stopped being that guy's friend, and I went with my other friends. And then we tormented him, and then he left school. So you say to yourself, well, that's how racism starts. Is when you do stuff that you don't know why it's wrong, but you feel in your heart that it's wrong. But there's no one there to tell you that it's wrong. And because the people that are your authority believe the same things. That's not wrong, and because I don't think it's wrong, then my kids shouldn't think it's wrong. And that's the whole point of it. And the thing is, so you're looking at today, right now, you're looking at this far-right, alt-right movement supported and largely normalized by Donald Trump. That's being, and it's a thing too. You have to understand. You have to understand too that 3/4 of the governorships and the representatives of the United States are controlled by the Grand Old Party, the party that revoked slavery. Well, the thing is, violence would only give the people that are perpetrating this racist violence fodder, and we see that conservative news media has really hijacked the democratic institutions of the United States. So why I'm on the opposition is because it's not there yet. The point to use violence isn't there yet. Because if you were to show up to, let's say, a Crossburn or something like that, where driving around town, it wouldn't be rare for you to see. And if you showed up to there and you said, you punched them right in your face, chances not you're going to get killed. So the thing is, if you're going to use violence, it's not the time, because it's not there yet. The tide is slowly turning. It's a slow tide. It will take a couple of years, a couple of decades, but it's not there yet. Give it time. But if it doesn't, thank you.